Everett Wallace, a man whose deep brown skin seemed to absorb and soften the harsh fluorescent light of any room, earned a respectable $68,000 a year as a logistics manager. He drove a 2014 Honda Accord with 112,000 miles on it, lived in a tidy one-bedroom apartment in Houston's 3rd Ward that cost him $1,250 a month in rent, and believed in the quiet dignity of a day's work. He was a simple man, or so the world believed. And on this Tuesday at 2:15 p.m., in a glass-walled conference room on the 47th floor of a skyscraper in downtown Houston, that simplicity was being used as a weapon against him. The room was cold, the air conditioned to a brisk 65 degrees. It smelled of expensive leather and old paper. Across the vast mahogany table, which probably cost more than his car, a solid $30,000 slab of polished wood, sat his fiancée, Camille Vance. Beside her were her parents, Arthur and Eleanor. Arthur, with his silver hair and a $4,000 canali suit, looked severe and impatient. Eleanor, draped in a cream-colored Chanel jacket that cost at least $9,000, radiated a frosty disappointment. Their family lawyer, a man named Mr. Henderson, with a face like a clenched fist, slid a thick document across the table. The embossed leather folder it was in whispered of money Everett had supposedly never touched. "It's just a formality, Everett," Camille said, her voice a little too bright. She was wearing a silk blouse worth $800, a casual choice for an afternoon of financial humiliation. "Daddy insists," Arthur grunted, a sound of pure dismissal. "It's not a formality. It's a necessity. We have to protect Camille's assets. You understand? You're bringing nothing to the table." The words hung in the sterile air. Nothing. Everett looked at his hands, resting on the table. They were strong, capable hands that had unloaded trucks in his youth and now orchestrated the complex ballet of global shipping. They were the hands that had fixed Camille's leaky faucet and held her when she cried over some petty social slight. They were, in Arthur Vance's estimation, worth nothing. Everett earned $68,000 a year. Camille's trust fund, which she would fully inherit on their wedding day, was valued at a little over $2 million. The math, in their eyes, was simple and brutal. Eleanor added, her voice dripping with condescension, "We just can't have you thinking you're entitled to the Vance family legacy, dear. It wouldn't be right." Everett felt a familiar, cold knot tightening in his stomach. He had known this was coming. For 6 months, every conversation had been laced with subtle and not so subtle reminders of his financial station. But this felt different. This was a ceremony of degradation. He was being asked to sign a document that legally codified his own worthlessness in their eyes. He picked up the document. The paper was heavy, a high-grade linen stock. The ink was a deep, uncompromising black. He started to read, his background in logistics making him preternaturally attentive to fine print and contractual language. "There's no need to read the whole thing," Henderson the lawyer said with a dismissive wave of his $1,200 Mont Blanc pen. "It's a standard prenuptial agreement. It stipulates that in the event of a divorce, all premarital assets remain separate property. You waive any and all claim to Miss Vance's trust, inheritance, and any appreciation of those assets during the marriage." He smiled, a tight, unpleasant curl of the lips. "Essentially, you leave with what you came with, which is, to be blunt, nothing." Arthur chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Sign it, Everett. Let's get this over with." Everett's eyes scanned the pages. The language was dense, suffocating. It felt like being buried alive in legalese. He saw the clauses about the River Oaks estate, the portfolio of stocks, the art collection. Everything was itemized, protected, walled off from him. It was a fortress of paper and ink. He was an outsider, being handed the visitor's rules. What would you do in this situation? How do you sit in a room with the woman you love and her family as they laugh at your life's work? We've all felt underestimated before, but this was a masterclass in humiliation. If you've ever been made to feel small, let me know in the comments. I think you'll appreciate where this is going. Everett continued to read, his silence stretching the tension in the room. He felt their impatience, their annoyance. Why was the poor man wasting their time reading a document whose conclusion was already foregone? He was supposed to be grateful, to sign with a humble flourish and accept his station. But Everett was a logistics man. He knew that the most important detail is often the one everyone else overlooks. And then, on page 14, in a subclause of a subclause, he found it. Their story hadn't started with lawyers and financial disclosures. It had started, ironically, at a charity gala. Everett wasn't there as a donor. His company had sponsored a table for $5,000, and as a senior manager, he was required to attend. He felt out of place in his one good suit, a simple black $450 Hugo Boss number he'd bought for a cousin's wedding. He stood near the bar, nursing a glass of club soda, watching a world he didn't belong to. The women were in glittering gowns that cost more than his monthly salary, their jewelry flashing under the ballroom lights. The men wore watches that could have paid off his student loans. Then he saw Camille. She was arguing with a waiter about the temperature of the champagne, but she did it with a kind of fiery charm that made Everett smile. She was beautiful, with luminous skin and her hair styled in elegant, intricate braids that fell over one shoulder. When she turned and caught him watching, her annoyance melted into a dazzling smile. They talked for hours, standing in a quiet corner away from the thrum of the auction. She was funny, sharp, and seemed genuinely interested in his life. She didn't scoff when he told her he was a logistics manager. She asked intelligent questions about supply chains and freight forwarding. For the first time, Everett felt seen by someone from that world. Their first few months were a whirlwind. They existed in a bubble, meeting for dinner at cozy, inexpensive restaurants in Montrose that Everett knew, or walking through Herman Park under the warm Texas sun. He fell in love with her quick laugh and the way she'd lean her head on his shoulder when they watched old movies in his small third ward apartment. The apartment was filled with books and the scent of the coffee he ground himself every morning. On the walls were framed photographs of his parents, two proud, smiling black people who had built a small but successful trucking company from nothing. The first crack in the facade appeared about 4 months in when he met her parents. He drove his 2014 Honda Accord to their estate in River Oaks. Pulling up the long, crushed stone driveway felt like driving onto a movie set. The house wasn't a house. It was a monument of glass and white stone, a $12 million architectural marvel that looked more like a modern art museum than a home. Arthur and Eleanor Vance greeted him in a cavernous living room with 20-foot ceilings and a wall of glass overlooking a pristine, manicured garden. "Everett," Arthur said, his handshake limp and brief. "Camille tells us you're in transportation." He said the word transportation, as if it were something one might scrape off the bottom of a shoe. "Logistics, sir," Everett corrected gently. "I manage international freight for a large firm." "Fascinating," Eleanor said, though her eyes were busy cataloging his off-the-rack $89 department store blazer and his sensible $120 Cole Haan shoes. "And what does a logistics manager make these days?" The question was so blunt, so nakedly transactional, that Everett was momentarily stunned. Camille jumped in, flustered. "Mother, you can't ask that." "Why not?" Arthur countered, settling into a severe-looking leather armchair that probably cost $15,000. "I'm just trying to get to know the young man. We have to understand his prospects." Everett, deciding that evasion was pointless, answered calmly. My salary is $68,000 a year, sir. A thick, heavy silence descended on the room. It was broken only by the faint hum of the industrial-grade air conditioning. Arthur and Eleanor exchanged a look. It was a fleeting glance, but it contained a whole universe of judgment. In that single moment, Everett Wallace was weighed, measured, and found wanting. The number, $68,000, hung in the air between them, an insult to the polished marble floors, and the abstract painting on the wall that Everett would later learn was a Gerhard Richter worth over $3 million. He looked at Camille, hoping for an ally. But she was looking at the floor, her cheeks flushed with what he realized with a sinking heart was not anger, but embarrassment. That evening was the beginning of the slow, grinding erosion of his dignity. The escalating betrayals became a regular feature of their relationship. They were rarely explosive. Instead, they were a series of 1,000 tiny cuts, each one delivered with a smile. At family dinners, Arthur would make a point of discussing his latest stock market windfall, a casual $500,000 gain on a tech IPO, before turning to Everett and asking, "How's the trucking business, son?" "It's logistics, Arthur," Everett would say, his voice even. "And it's going well, thank you." "Good, good," Arthur would reply, patting him on the shoulder in a gesture that was meant to look paternal, but felt deeply condescending. A man needs a hobby. Camille, caught between the man she loved and the family whose approval she craved, became an unwilling accomplice. When her parents belittled Everett's job, she would offer a weak defense. "Daddy, stop it. Everett works very hard." But then she would turn to Everett later and say, "You can't blame them, babe. They just don't understand your world. Maybe you could think about getting an MBA? Or going into finance? My cousin Stephen makes $400,000 a year as a junior analyst." The suggestions were always framed as loving concern for his future, for their future. But the subtext was clear. You are not enough. Your life, your career, your $68,000, it's not enough. He started to feel like a project, a fixer-upper she had taken on. She loved his character, his stability, his kindness. But she was deeply ashamed of his balance sheet. The engagement was a perfect example of this duality. He proposed in Herman Park at sunset with a simple, elegant sapphire ring he had spent 3 months saving for. It cost $4,200, nearly a month's take-home pay. It was the most expensive thing he had ever bought. Camille cried and said yes. She loved the ring. She truly did. For a week, she showed it off to everyone. Then, they had dinner with her parents. Eleanor squinted at the ring under the light of their dining room chandelier, a $50,000 fixture of cascading crystal. "Oh, it's sweet, dear," she said, her voice thin, very understated. The next day, Camille came to his apartment. She was wearing a new ring, a massive, blinding diamond, at least 4 carats, set in platinum. It had replaced the sapphire. "Daddy thought the other one was a bit delicate for everyday wear," she explained, avoiding his eyes. "This is the family engagement ring. It's just for show, you know. I'll still wear your, sometimes." The sapphire ring, his $4,200 declaration of love, was relegated to a jewelry box. The new ring, a $150,000 monster, became the public symbol of their engagement. When friends complimented it, Camille would say, "Oh, it's a family heirloom." A convenient fiction that erased Everett's contribution entirely. The cruelty became more overt as the wedding planning began. The Vances were planning a lavish affair at the Houstonian Hotel, a $200,000 spectacle for 300 of their closest friends and business associates. Everett was never consulted on the budget, the venue, or the guest list. He was simply informed. When he tried to offer an opinion, Arthur would cut him off. "Everett, what do you know about planning an event of this scale? Let us handle it. Your only job is to show up. One Saturday afternoon, Camille took him to be fitted for his wedding suit. He assumed they were going to a decent menswear store, perhaps the same one where he'd bought his Hugo Boss suit. Instead, she pulled her white BMW 3 Series, a $43,000 car, into the parking lot of a generic low-end suit warehouse. "My parents' wedding gift to you," she announced cheerfully. Inside, a bored salesman measured him. The suits were racks upon racks of polyester blends and ill-fitting jackets. Arthur and Eleanor were there, observing the process from a distance. Eleanor picked out a shiny silver-gray suit. It felt cheap to the touch. The tag said $299.99. "This one will do," Eleanor declared. "It looks festive." Everett stood in front of the mirror. The suit hung off his shoulders. The fabric was stiff and uncomfortable. He looked like a man playing dress-up in someone else's bad taste. Meanwhile, Camille had been talking for weeks about her custom-made wedding gown, a $22,000 creation by a famous designer. The contrast was staggering, a deliberate and calculated insult. "What do you think?" Camille asked, her eyes shining. She genuinely seemed to think this was a wonderful gesture. Everett looked at his reflection, then at the Vances, who were watching him with expressions of faint amusement. He felt a cold, hard anger crystallize in his chest. It was an anger he hadn't felt in years, a deep, primal fury, but his face remained a calm, unreadable mask. "It's very generous," he said, his voice quiet. "Thank you." This was the man who walked into the lawyer's office to sign the prenup. A man who had been slowly, systematically stripped of his pride. They thought he was a simple man, a poor man, a man they could push around and patronize. They saw his calm demeanor as weakness. They saw his modesty as a lack of ambition. They had no idea how wrong they were. They had no idea what was coming. There on page 14, nestled in Article 5, Section 3, subsection C, was the sentence that changed everything. The document was meticulously crafted to protect every penny of the Vance family's $2 million fortune from him. But their lawyer, in his arrogance and haste to build an ironclad wall around Camille's assets, had included a standard reciprocal clause. It read, "Furthermore, any and all assets, trusts, holdings, or properties held by either party prior to the date of marriage, which are not explicitly disclosed in Schedule A or Schedule B of this agreement, shall remain the sole and separate property of the originating party, impervious to any and all claims by the other party in the event of marital dissolution." Henderson had only filled out Schedule A, Camille's assets. It was a long and detailed list, from her stock portfolio down to her grandmother's silver. Schedule B, Everett Wallace's assets, was comically, insultingly blank. A single line had been typed in the middle of the empty page. Personal checking account, approximate value, $3,500. They hadn't even bothered to ask him. They had just assumed. They assumed his $68,000 salary, his Honda Accord, and his rented apartment were the sum total of his existence. They had built a fortress to keep him out. But their lawyer had, in his hubris, built that fortress with a secret door. And he had just handed Everett the key. A slow, cold calm washed over Everett. The knot in his stomach dissolved. The anger in his chest cooled into something hard and sharp, like steel. He looked up from the document. Arthur was checking his $25,000 Patek Philippe watch. Eleanor was examining her manicure. Camille was scrolling through her phone, probably looking at wedding photographers. Everett picked up the $1,200 Mont Blanc pen. It felt heavy and powerful in his hand. He clicked it. The sound was sharp and definitive in the quiet room. All eyes snapped to him. "Is there a problem, Everett?" Arthur asked, his voice laced with irritation. Everett met his gaze. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to be polite or deferential. He felt a profound and liberating sense of nothing. "No, Arthur," he said, his voice steady and clear. "No problem at all." He signed his name on the signature line. The stroke of the pen was smooth, the ink a dark, final black. He slid the document back across the polished mahogany. "It seems perfectly fair," he said. Henderson, the lawyer, gave a satisfied smirk. Eleanor let out a small sigh of relief. Arthur grunted a sound of victory. "Good," he said. "Now that that's settled." Camille beamed at him, a radiant smile of pure relief. She came around the table and kissed him on the cheek. "Thank you, baby," she whispered, her relief palpable. "I knew you'd understand." He smiled back at her, a gentle, sad smile. "Of course," he said. "I understand completely." What none of them knew, what they couldn't possibly fathom, was the nature of the secret he held. They saw a logistics manager. They didn't see the son of James and Sarah Wallace, the quiet, brilliant founders of Wallace Freight, a non-asset-based logistics company they started in the 1980s. They had been pioneers, building a sophisticated brokerage that connected shippers with carriers long before it was fashionable,